Patterns of evolution and construct an explanation of understanding how new species are formed, how they've evolved from pre existing species. There are several patterns that we see in evolution. Now, these are very broad patterns, but they're very observable in nature. Not only can we actually see them happening, but we can also measure and track them. So they are speciation, extinction, gradualism, punctuated equilibrium, divergent evolution, convergent evolution, and then coevolution. We're just going to hit on each of these individually. So, speciation is the formation of a new species, and that's through evolution, a process from a pre existing species. Before you understand how this happens, we might want to talk about what exactly is a species. And that is a group of organisms that can successfully interbreed and reproduce offspring that can also breed. So, in order for a group of organisms to be a species, they have to produce offspring that are also reproductive. Some sort of isolation usually occurs from that group, and then just over a long period of time, that gene pool becomes different. And for a variety of different reasons, it's not always cellular, but it can also be habit. They're no longer going to interbreed with its original species. And so a new group can form, hint, a new species. At some point, the two groups are not going to be reproductive with each other any longer. Extinction is the elimination of a species. Gradual extinction occurs at a very, very slow rate. We see this a lot when a natural disaster happens, or we hear about it in the news all the time, climate change. A mass extinction is when a catastrophic celestial event usually happens, and the event takes on the environment so suddenly that life cannot respond or adapt to the new change in their environment. So mass extinctions are usually through like a meteor, a tsunami, a massive volcanic eruption that takes out an island or small villages or an ecological system. Gradualism is a slow, constant change in a population over a long period of time. A good example of this are the peppered moths. Peppered moths are widespread throughout Britain, England, and they're usually just in people's gardens. But there's an amazing story that's been pretty made famous around the world, and it's really one that best describes evolution. Evolution, more specifically, by natural selection, which was Darwin's great discovery. So these moths are normally white and black, hence the name peppered. They have speckled wings, and their patterns make them very well camouflaged against the lichens that cover the tree trunks. These moths have a naturally occurring genetic mutation which causes some of the moths to have these almost black wings. And these black wings are very not well camouflaged at all against the lichens, against the trees. So they're more likely to be eaten by birds and predators because they're more easily seen. So this generally means that there are fewer black moths that survive to breed, and so the black moth is less common in that population of peppered moths. But during the 19th century, it was noticed that in towns that were cities where they actually had a huge black pepper moth population, there was industrialization going on. It's just the turn of the century. It's the industrial revolution coming through all countries, not just America, but out in Europe too. So these factories with domestic coal fires, they cause this like sooty air pollution, and it basically killed off all the lichens that were against the trees out in these urban areas. And so now the pale moths had nothing to camouflage against the background of the trees with, and so now that they were likely to become eaten. And as a result, over several generations, the black moths started to outnumber the pale moths as they were better camouflaged. But by the time the mid 20th century came around, there were laws that were introduced that reduced the air pollution out in these areas. And so after the quality of air improved, the lichens began to grow back against the trees. And once the normal ecosystem had returned, we now notice that the peppered moth population camouflage was less likely to be black. The black moths became more noticeable, and so they were preyed upon a lot easier, and the situation reversed itself. And actually, this is the same type of evolution that we see not only in Europe but also in the United States, because these moths are so widespread across the planet. It was an equitable, noticeable thing amongst different naturalists, amongst different countries, hence accepting this gradualism term for evolution. So punctuated equilibrium is, unlike gradualism, is a very burst of change followed by very long periods of stability. One of the best examples of this is the mammalian population that happened during the Mesozoic and Paleozoic eras. There were 5 mass extinction events. It was a mass extinction event followed by a very long time period of very little change and a lot of stability. And mammals were good at dealing with that stability. Now, divergent evolution is when there's a number of different species and they arise from one common ancestor. Usually, new environments cause differences to evolve in populations. There's some sort of ancestral mammal. We don't know exactly what it is, but all mammals have diverged from this one ancestral mammal. Well, we have a clue about what we think that this creature was. It's more of like a squirrel rat kind of creature, but nevertheless, there's an ancestral mammal that bears and apes, elephants, koala bears, marsupials, that all of these animals, these organisms, have diverged from. They share a common ancestor. We now know this through genetic information, and they were separated a very long time ago and eventually evolved into very, very different species. Now, a type of divergent evolution that occurs on a very small scale in a very short period of time is what we call adaptive radiation. A good example of adaptive radiation would be sea mammals. So if you think about it, there's a lot of different types of sea mammals, like whales and killer whales and dolphins. And in the fossil record, we see these appear and increase in number very, very rapidly. It's this rapid increase in number of species that all have a common ancestor, but they're morphologically very, very different. Which leads me into my next point, which is convergent evolution. This is when unrelated species evolve similar characteristics because they live in a certain environment or they live in similar environments. So they are adapting to that one niche in the environment. And although all of these animals here fly, none of them actually have an ancestor that's closely related. This hawk here is a bird. It's Avis. The bat is a mammal. And we know that this pterodactyl right here, and that was a reptile. So all of these organisms, they're completely unrelated to each other, yet they all look very similar, and they are in the same environment, which is through the air. This is an example of convergent evolution. And finally, coevolution. This is a really special type of evolution. This occurs when two populations of organisms, they form a specialized relationship. And so when the population of one changes, the other one tends to change with it. And this is in response to each other. Flowers and insects are a great example of this. Over long periods of time, as angiosperms and flowering plants have evolved, we see this direct evolution pattern with insects as well, where they take to flight and then they evolve their reproductive cycles around seasons when flowers bloom and such. So it's a very interesting relationship and just a vivid example of evolution.